funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
Over the years, many Irish missionary women have done Trojan work in various faraway lands, whether helping to establish and run schools and hospitals in Asia, or working with AIDS sufferers in Africa, or 1,001 other similar scenarios. What unites such Irish missionary women is their undying passion for life and social justice.
We went into small communities in poorer areas and lived among the people and did more social work.
Helping people to help themselves. We're building up the capacity of people to help themselves.
I was zealous and ready to go, or to feed the hungry in Africa.
We were serving the people.
The needy, the poor, the down and outs, the sick. Reaching out and offering hope, I think, is very, very important.
Over the next 3 programmes in this Making a Difference series, we're going to investigate the stories of 9 Irish missionary sisters. To begin, we focus on Africa. In the year 1977, Sister Mary Bradley of the Missionary Sisters of the Holy Rosary arrived into Kenya. Her mission to educate women there.
Education, and that was our main thrust at that time, was education, the education of women, and we dedicated ourselves to that.
So what were the challenges which Mary faced in her teaching work in Kenya?
They wanted to be educated, so you didn't have really discipline problems, not really. What we were fighting would have been circumcision, female circumcision. And we would have been fighting to keep them in school rather than marrying them off. They were the challenges, not in the education, the way you're talking about it here, discipline problems, bullying. That never, not for me. I don't know what it's like now, but for me that wasn't there. But it was, as I say, the whole question around circumcision and how you dealt with that and how you encouraged the girls or how you helped them, because sometimes they ran away because they didn't want to be circumcised, not because they were being educated. I would say to the girls themselves, I said, listen girls, it's not up to me. I cannot interfere with your culture, but you can. You can fight it now for your daughters and your granddaughters. Begin now. And that's the only kind of help and advice that I was able to give them. But what I was dealing with was when the girls came back to school or began school in January, the school year was January, there were very often a lot of infections because the circumcisions were carried out very badly, because it's the one blade used for all the girls. So it was quite risky.
By the mid-1980s, Mary had delegated her teaching work to local Kenyan sisters and began to pour much of her energies into tackling the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which was then causing untold suffering and death in Kenya and beyond.
What I did was, now I was working with youth, and I was the parish sister in the cathedral parish, Christ the King Cathedral Parish in Nakuru. So I was dealing with the youth, and we did a huge amount. I set up a whole program on AIDS, dealing with it, but it was youth to youth. So I decided then, at least I got an opportunity of going into Uganda. That's where they really were making great strides in coping with the AIDS problem. And I went with priests from the cathedral parish and the youth. I brought them all with me, and it was a superb experience. So then when we came back into Kenya, we began to set up workshops, and we began to travel around the different dioceses, doing a lot of work, because we saw that the AIDS was hitting particularly the catering industry. They were spending a fortune on teaching their staff, catering, hotel, everything, because of all the lodges and theme parks and national parks where all the animals are. And their money was being wasted because their staff were dying from AIDS and couldn't continue, and the money wasn't there. So something had to be done. So through education, it began to change quite a bit. But it was youth to youth, and only the youth could make that decision themselves, just like the circumcision. It was in their hands. Now, what are you going to do with it? You've been educated. How are you going to use those tools? I've given them to you. Now, you pick up your needle, or you pick up your thread, or you pick up your hammer, or whatever you're going to pick up. In this case, it's education and your own self-control.
In the 1990s, the area in Kenya in which Mary Bradley lived and worked in experienced severe ethnic cleansing. When due primarily to a land war, Kalenjin troops were ordered to attack and take out local Kikuyu people.
The ethnic cleansing was so bad that we had a big meeting in the cathedral. And the bishop, and it was Ndingi at the time, he was the bishop of Nakuru at that time. We agreed that we were going to have a protest march, and it would be non-violent, of course. And then they teased me that they were going to put me in the very front because I could be the sacrificial lamb. And I said, you'll do no such thing. I said, I'll be hiding behind you, one of the fellas now about nearly 7 foot. And I said, if anything happens, you'll get it first. And I'm so short, the bullet will go through you and hit who's behind me. I said, but anyway, that was trying to break the seriousness, and it was a serious moment. So we began, and how it was, all the women were in the centre, and the men then were on the outside. So we were almost, if you like, the way the South Africans, the Zulus fight with the horns. We moved. And Nakuru, the street of Nakuru, very, very wide street. And as we were marching, more and more and more people joined in the march. Men, women and children. And of course we were saying the rosary. And right enough, I was close to the front. And when we came into the township of Nakuru itself, the actual town of Nakuru, all I could see was on each side of me, lined up right down the whole street, was all these soldiers in battle gear. They were heavily armed with these Kalashnikov guns pointed at us, and the visors, the whole lot there. So I said, this is it now. So I remember praying. I said, Lord, let me be killed rather than seriously injured. So as we moved now, we were coming up and we were almost abreast. So at the corner of my eye, I could see the line of soldiers, the first fellow. And it was the fellow to my right. What he did, he put his gun down on the ground and he's turned his back to us. The second fellow did the same. Then I looked over to my left and I saw them doing the very same on the left-hand side. And as we moved down the street, all the soldiers put those huge guns down on the ground and turned their backs on us. Now, we moved down to the very end of the street and there were these huge big army lorries packed to the gills with soldiers with those big heavy tarpaulins over it. With that, we were up against it now. I could almost touch the soldier. And one of them just stuck his head out of the lorry and he said, Sister Mary, any rosary beads? Sister Mary, any rosary beads? And luckily we had some and we threw them to the soldiers. We continued with our march, marched all the way back to the cathedral. We continued with the vigil. I went home because at 6 o'clock the youth picked up the vigil, and they worked right through from 6 o'clock in the evening until I came back again at 6 o'clock the next morning. I didn't work the night vigil, but they did. The youth group was up singing, dancing, praising God. And nobody will ever tell me that prayer doesn't work, because that would have been a total massacre. Thousands of us would have been killed or maimed.
Those soldiers had been ordered to go in and get rid of you, take you out basically, and it totally, the situation reversed.
They didn't do it. We were talking about it for weeks, the miracle of Nakuru. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
It didn't happen anyway, and we were sure, but they didn't do it.
And veering away from Africa and turning our attention to Asia. In 1965, Sister Margaret O'Brien of the Columban Missionary Sisters went to work as a radiologist in the Rotunji TB Sanatorium in Hong Kong. By the way, the sanatorium was run by the Columban Missionary Sisters.
We went to Hong Kong, and then I started working in Rotunji Sanatorium. We had already had 2 other sisters who were radiographers. So, but in the meantime, we had taken on another hospital. We were requested to take a hospital for the treatment of children with mostly congenital disorders, or mostly polio, actually, in fact. You had some TB bone, you had congenital disorders and polio. So that was a beautiful service, really, a wonderful service.
And here's what Margaret had to say about the work done by her colleagues in the Rotunji Sanatorium in Hong Kong, which helped to contribute to the global eradication of TB.
There was wonderful surgery, spinal surgery. You know, we're talking about scoliosis here in Ireland now and how many cases there are. We were doing a lot of cases there and pioneering stuff. You know, the doctors, the surgeons, they had new methods and everything for straightening the spine prior surgery, and wonderful results, really. So it was fascinating what was happening. It was
kind of exciting times, and yourself and your colleagues are trying to, push the envelope and getting cures for TB, because this is a time that TB still hasn't been, like we all think of it as, it'll never be eradicated fully, but the bulk of it that had plagued the world for eons had still to be eradicated, and you were in the middle of that eradication, so to speak.
And we had 2 doctors who did a lot of research. They worked with the British Medical Association, sending all sorts of information as to this, and then finding what were the best treatments in terms of types of medication, because what might suit a Westerner or European might not necessarily suit an Asian person or a Chinese. So they were able to sift out what were the best treatments for each one, And
this would have been Sister Gabriel O'Mahony and Sister Aquinas, if I'm correct.
Right,
yes?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Your sister yourself as well. I mean, you were involved in radiography. What did the work entail now?
Well, it was very simple in a sense, and that time, of course, you had films, you don't have the electronics thing now that you have now. But it was essential, of course, absolutely essential. So you did mostly chest x-rays, or then if there was TB spine, bone, we would be doing that as well. But it was very straightforward, really. Then we took on a lot of mass x-ray. Part of the hospital service, they had a very good team who would go out to do mass surveys.
So just who were the patients whom the Rotunji Sanatorium cared for?
A lot of the patients, of course, would have been refugees too from China at the time, because if we're talking about the communists took over
power in 49,
and the sisters started around that time, So, but there was great relationship built up between the patients, and then we had a convalescent home. That was wonderful because they were so poor, they couldn't just go home. The nutrition wouldn't be there for them, really, that they needed. So that was a great thing.
By the mid-1970s, the hard work of Margaret O'Brien and her colleagues had helped to contribute to the eradication of TB in Hong Kong.
TB was really on the way out. I mean, it was treatable, it was being treated, and it was planned by the association in charge of running the hospital to turn it into a general hospital. So that was where it was. So then the sisters began to, like all of us, we began to look at possibilities. What are the other areas we could serve? So hospice was a big thing that came about. It was already, they were doing some hospice work within Ruttanji. A few of the sisters were involved, and Sister Gabriel particularly was the doctor. She was lending her expertise to the establishing of that society for hospice care. And that was built then. And the sisters, they were engaged in home visitation and things like that, various things like that. And we had established schools too in the meantime. Well, one we established ourselves in a poor area. Another one, American sisters asked if we would take it over. And we had sisters emerging from college here in Ireland, and it was decided, yes, we'd go for it. So we booked 2 schools more or less at the same time.
And after undertaking numerous jobs from the year 1976 onwards, eventually in the year 1994, Margaret O'Brien got involved in clinical pastoral care, otherwise called hospital chaplaincy, in particular for psychiatric patients.
It was what I liked best. Of all the things I did, I liked it best. I used to go to the psychiatric wards in the general hospital, and there was only about 2 or 3 wards. But then at the weekend I'd be substituting for somebody and I would be asked to see this patient. But then when I moved into the psychiatric hospital as such, I was full-time then with patients who were psychiatric illness. It was just that, they needed somebody who understood them, and could address their needs in that sense. I mean, people with delusions, hallucinations, I understood that. And when you'd say to them, yes, I know you're experiencing they were relieved, because most people would say, this is only in your mind, you're only thinking that, it's not really real. Like, these are so important for people to understand, I found that was very effective, really.
That's fantastic, sister. So in other words, you had a gift. I mean, this is where you found your niche, so to speak. Am I right?
It seemed to be just like that, it was just, and it was the heel of the hunt, really. It was the end, nearly, because I continued there until 2005. And
so
then
the best part of 10 years into CP work, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true. It must have been about that amount of time, yeah.
And getting back to Africa once more, in the year 1970, Sister Isabel Smith of the Medical Missionaries of Mary went to Tanzania in order to undertake administration work in a hospital there.
It was a wonderful time. I was administering a fairly small 150-bed hospital in a semi-desert area. Very exciting, very fulfilling. I have a very warm spot in my heart for Tanzania.
What were the challenges of the work, Isabel?
I suppose finance, keeping the bills paid, keeping the staff salaries paid. We lived through the nationalisation of the banks. I remember going to the bank manager after the banks were nationalised and negotiating with him that he would send an armed jeep to the hospital compound every 2 weeks on a Friday, and the staff would be paid by cheque for the first time ever, not cash, and they would learn the old principles of savings. And so we did that, and every second Friday the jeep would trundle out from the town about 20 miles away, and the armed guard would be there, and the staff learned. It was a huge development for them to transition from being absolutely, if you like, almost illiterate to being people with a bank account. It was a major development. Then we already had a midwifery school there, but we started a pre-nursing school. There were a lot of young teenagers in the area who would love to have been nurses, but there was no secondary school. So we had staff who were part-time working, and part-time students, and they then would be interviewed by the schools of nursing that we had elsewhere. They were very good candidates to become student nurses by the time they had spent maybe a year with us. And then, of course, the other challenge was building. We were in a very dry area. Our architect had to fly in from Dar es Salaam, a journey of 500 miles, in a small 2-engined plane. And that was exciting. We had the flying doctors coming in every 6 weeks. We had an airstrip, of course, at the hospital. And our only source of communication was radio telephone, which we did every day at 1:30. We could speak to all our houses in Tanzania, which were, more than 1,000 miles apart, some of them. And every day at 1:30 we could transmit a short message. And we had the same system in the Turkana Desert in Kenya. And so the coming of the flying doctors was always a big challenge, because you had to have your operating theatre and staff, on the ready, depending on what specialisation was coming in. It could be ophthalmology this month, it could be orthopaedic next month. And then, of course, the flying doctors would fly out on the second or third day, and their highly trained theatre staff. And then you were with wards full of very sick people that you had to get back on their feet. And it's still going on. That very same procedure is still happening there. The last time I was in Tanzania a couple of years ago, the flying doctors were coming in the week after I was there, and I could see, things have modernised a lot since, but it's the same procedure. If you're that far away from central services, well, then you have to bring the service to the people, and that's what we did, and that's what we do.
And so in other words, the systems had to be in place, as well as you were saying, when the guys arrive. If the system's not in place, there are going to be problems.
Yes, well, we worked very closely with the Flying Medical Service. There's an organisation in Nairobi called AMREF, the African Medical and Research Foundation, but they do terrific training of personnel appropriate to the African scenario, and they operate a flying doctor service. There's also a flying medical service now working out of Arusha. And it's collaboration. Missionary work from start to finish is a work of collaboration. No small group like ourselves, or small community like we were, 7 to 12 people, depending on the time, can work alone. The local people take an awful lot of the responsibility, and then the expertise that you get from other organisations fills the gaps.
So in other words, really, Sister Isabel, it's all about people. It's all about, knowing the people, getting on with the people, working together, teamwork.
That's right. And it's a terrific vocation. It's a terrific challenge. It's very fulfilling. And really, you don't know what's coming next. You never know when you get up in the morning what that day is going to bring.
And after her time in Tanzania, Isabel returned back to Ireland to work as their congregational secretary for the Medical Missionaries of Mary, as well as to undertake some study. Following this, in the year 1980, she went on the missions to Brazil, where she worked in many areas, including human rights and also literacy classes for women.
Literacy classes. We use the Paulo Freire methodology, which is, he was the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he had worked out, he had been Minister for Education, and he had worked out an approach that was appropriate, culturally appropriate. And you would just...
What was the approach?
Well, we had pictures. The first thing we did was to try and convince the women that they had culture, because they felt that because they hadn't literacy, they hadn't culture. So we would have to value the culture they have and help them to value. And then we would show them a picture, maybe of the neighbourhood, maybe a photograph we took or a drawing, and we would ask them to identify all the things they could see in the picture. And they would see, I see a child with a kite, I see a shop, I see a woman with a bread under her arm, and so on. And then you would say to them, okay, so those are all the things that are in the picture. Now, what do you read? What's going on in the picture? And then you stand back and you look at the story the picture is telling. And then you try and say, so you do know how to read. You know how to read a picture. So now we have certain signs that represent words. You already have the words. You have a great command of the words. So now we will show you. So the nearest big town in our area was called Lapa, and the bus used to go to Lapa. And we would say, well, look, we'd write LA for La and PA for Pa on a whiteboard or something like that. And then they would learn learn that that's la and that's pa. Now, if you put the two together, what do you get? You get la pa. And then isn't that what's written on the bus that you get when you go up there, that brown bus? So they say, oh yeah, so now you know how to read la pa. And then we would go on from there, on to bigger words with more syllables.
So it's real kind of carrot, and enticing people along and getting them interested and getting them the inquiring mind and, the bus to Lapa. Yeah, I never realised what those figures on the top of the bus are. So this is real, and it worked, Isabella.
But meanwhile, you're learning too, because, one of the first discussions you have is what is culture, and you ask them, well, so what is culture? Well, now, did anybody in your primary school or secondary school ever ask you, what is culture? And I would say to these women, so what is culture? And one woman in the class, I remember she thought very much, and she said, I suppose it's everything a mother teaches her child. Now, I often ask myself, is there a better definition of culture?
That's a very wise answer.
Yeah, so that's what I mean by saying you learn, you get more than you give. And I asked another woman, I was interviewing another woman for a piece I was writing later, who had learned to read and write, and I asked her, tell me, what was it like? And she said, it's like coming into this planet. Before, she said, you were on a different planet. And then when you were able to read and write, you realised that you're on a new planet now. You're here on Earth where everybody else knows how to read and write. But before that, I was outside the Earth.
Wow, I'd say for yourself, Isabel, it must have been a great job satisfaction factor, because really you're talking about core fundamentals here.
Well, that's literacy work, but you can apply the same to Alcoholics Anonymous. Anybody who is shifting in life from where they're trapped to where they're free, and they're taking the steps, you're only accompanying them. So the real discovery that, I was an alcoholic last month, now I have a month of freedom from it. It doesn't matter what aspect of our missionary vocation we are implementing or with what skill set. It's these wonderful transformations in people's lives which they themselves make. You're only facilitating it, but you're part of a very privileged scenario.
And to hear more inspirational stories of Irish missionary sisters working in faraway lands, then make sure to catch our next number 2 programme in this 3-part Making a Difference series. From myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.